I look at art like a puzzle. Why do people cherish it? What makes it compelling? And questions such as these bug me even more when art drifts from the conventionally beautiful. This is the work of Francis Bacon. Art review. When reviewing art, my goal is not to project my own aesthetic philosophies onto the work, but rather to understand the artwork from the artist's perspective. So, who hurt Francis Bacon? Francis Bacon was born in Dublin, Ireland. He was gay and behaved effeminately since early childhood. This angered his father, who would have him whipped. Their relationship was deeply troubled and a source of immense trauma, but it gets even weirder when Bacon later admits to being sexually attracted to his father. Eventually, his father caught him admiring himself in front of the mirror wearing his mother's underwear and had him kicked out. From there, he moved to London, living off his mother's trust fund and stealing to supplement it. He found himself drifting through London's homosexual underworld during a time when homosexuality was illegal. Ultimately, he became an interior decorator to pay the bills. His career took a while to really take off. His first major success was in 1944 with the painting 3 Studies for Figures at the Base of a Crucifixion. The triptych paintings were supposedly inspired by the Greek tragedies and the Oresteia. Bacon said he saw images in a series and painted accordingly. Again, these images strike me as emotional, but enigmatic. There is suffering, but also confusion and sickness. They took the world of high culture by storm. But why? The soul of Bacon's art, I believe, is best captured by the image of a screaming face. He was obsessed with this image from the movie Battleship Potemkin, as well as this iconic portrait of Pope Innocent X. This inspired over 50 paintings of screaming popes. Throughout his life, he was in multiple toxic relationships. One of his partners was deeply sadistic, and Francis would get beat up in physical altercations, but Francis reportedly enjoyed this. In another relationship, his partner was an alcoholic who eventually committed suicide, overdosing on a toilet. His name was George Dyer, and he became a recurring theme throughout Francis Bacon's work. It is no wonder Francis could capture suffering so authentically. He was no stranger to hardship. All of this gives us some insight into the artist's mind. Francis was clearly a deeply troubled and neurotic person, but what does he think his artwork means? Analyzing art is an unusual and difficult task. More often than not, an artist isn't trying to express any explicit ideas, or at least avoid saying that they do, to maintain the appeal.
It's interesting that people want to read meanings into your pictures, as if they were problem pictures or narrative pictures of some sort.
But one wants to read, and people like to get a meaning from everything.
But they want to get a sort of story, don't they? Or to see the pictures as a kind of comment.
They do,
on
yes.
society.
They do.
Is it ever intended to be that?
No.
I believe Francis Bacon's art was honestly inspired by his feelings, but there are of course ideas that underlie feelings. Francis was existing in the post-World War II era. He lived through the war, everyone had witnessed atrocities, and everyone was still scrambling to make sense of the human predicament in this new disenchanted world. People began to see the world in the darkest of lights because they were forced to acknowledge it. The sentiment of the world was that God is dead, we are all nothing more than sentient meat, and life is full of suffering. I believe this is part of why Francis's work had the appeal that it did at the time that it did, because it conveys that message with its screaming popes and its slabs of meat. But perhaps it's even more personal. Perhaps the portrayals of suffering are built on that confusing sadomasochism. It is neurotic, yes, but neurotic themes resonate in a neurotic world. That would explain the sense of sickness and the portrayals of parts of humanity that are ignored by the popular depictions of idealized beings. Instead, he depicted mankind's animalistic and transgressive nature. He reportedly said, "I feel ever so strongly that an artist must be nourished by his passions and his despairs. These things alter an artist's work, whether for the good, or the better, or the worse." No matter what logic is underneath the man's emotion, it is clear that Francis Bacon is alive in his artwork.
As man realizes that he is an accident and his futility, that he's a completely really futile being, that he has to play out the game without reason. I think that even when Velázquez was painting, even when Rembrandt was painting, in a peculiar way, they were still, whatever their attitude to life was, they were still slightly conditioned by certain types of religious possibilities. which man now, you could say, has been completely cancelled out for him. Now, of course, man can only attempt to make something very, very positive by trying to beguile himself for a time by the way he behaves, by prolonging possibly his life, by buying a kind of immortality through the doctors. You see, painting has now become, or all art has now become, completely a game by which man distracts himself. What is fascinating actually is that it's going to become much more difficult for the artist because he must really deepen the game to be any good at all and return the onlooker to life more violently.
As for me, it's harder to see what about his art would make me want to go back to life more valiantly. He was clearly inspired by Nietzsche, and where Nietzsche had his Dionysian spirit with Francis, I find an absurd acceptance of reality, the acceptance of sadomasochism and animalism. And I'm sure this acceptance, this realism, is empowering to a lot of people, but it doesn't quite resonate with me. But that would be me doing the all-too-human thing of trying to find answers in his work when maybe they are best interpreted as questions. The conflicted questions and emotions of a disenchanted man. If you have any other artists you would like me to review, feel free to comment them down below. Thank you guys. Bye.